it's not just that we have a president who has decided to disregard all the boundaries, is that the political cost of respecting boundaries has just gone away. You're relying on the goodwill of one person, and that's not the system that the founding fathers had in mind.
Welcome to the Diplomacy Podcast, where we explore how diplomacy shapes our world and our lives. My guest today is Elizabeth Saunders, a professor of political science at Columbia University. Her work focuses on the domestic politics of international relations and US foreign policy. I invited her because I read a piece recently she wrote in Foreign Affairs magazine titled, let me make sure I got the title right, Imperial President at Home, Emperor Abroad. And I thought, well, imperial foreign policy, that sounds like a very good topic for a podcast episode. So welcome, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I think it's important to note that the headline draws from the famous phrase from Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who wrote about the Imperial Presidency. And so the Imperial Presidency is a phrase that kind of refers to the dominance of the executive. So it's not so much that it's imperial in the sense of building an empire abroad, but that it is imperious. It is the whim of a single person conducting foreign policy, essentially unchecked. I try always to put this in the context of things that I teach and things that I write about. And one of the big trends that we've had in scholarship on democracies and autocracies and international relations in the last decade or so is this idea that the world is not divided into democracies and everybody else, which is essentially the way we used to divide the world as IR scholars. And I'm sure diplomats would have probably taken issue with that repeatedly and understand this much better than we do. But from a theoretical perspective, one of the big innovations of the last decade has been that we've now begun to unpack the difference between a personalist dictatorship like North Korea or Saddam Hussein's Iraq and competitive authoritarian regimes that do have opposition parties and some constraints on the executive. And that has long been a field of study for area specialists and those who study comparative politics. But thinking about how those countries' domestic distinctions translate into foreign policy is relatively new for IR scholars. And I realize that sounds a little crazy, but it's important to note that just the idea that democracies were different from non-democracies is still only about, depending on how you count, 20 to 30 years old is an accepted wisdom in IR. So one of the things that literature really uncovers is that the personalist dictatorships have the more volatile, really sort of capricious, and it's not irrational, but it's not geared towards confronting threats the way you would expect a democracy to do. And I do think that we've now begun to see that the United States has systematically dismantled the checks and constraints on the presidency in the foreign policy realm. It's fair to say that we now have the foreign policy of a personalist dictatorship.
You've written before about the Supreme Court decision that had to do with presidential immunity in 2024 and its impact on foreign policy. Based on the first 6 months of the second Trump administration, can you explain why you think it's justified to perhaps label it as imperial or an imperious dictator exercising it?
I'm no constitutional lawyer, but it really seemed to take the constitutional lawyers that I read regularly and respect a lot by surprise last summer. Essentially granted Donald Trump and all future presidents immunity for their official acts, not just the acts themselves, but that those acts could not be used as evidence of wrongdoing in post-presidential contexts. And so I think that essentially means that, in theory, the United States could violate international law with impunity and there would be no, the domestic mechanisms for attempting to enforce that, which are not particularly strong to begin with, would have no force. If the president violated the law domestically, again, it's hard to see how the Supreme Court would constrain the president. And that's before you even get to the question of the political composition of the Supreme Court, which we know now is very favorable to Trump. But it essentially unbounds the presidency from the constraints of law. And that is, it's always been very difficult, politically speaking, for Congress, for the court. The courts have never been particularly willing to step in and constrain the president on matters of national security. So I'm not suggesting that the presidency was a pious follower of rules, and subject to constraints in the foreign policy realm previously. Far from it, right? This is where you really have seen the presidency, going all the way back to Harry Truman, kind of pushing the envelope. But there is always the shadow of the political costs of breaking the law or pushing the envelope. And I think this just sort of stripped away all pretense. And Donald Trump is someone who has pushed the bounds of laws and norms for all the time he's occupied the Oval Office previously, and certainly in the first 6 months of his second term. And so I think it codified the possibility that he might come into, the ruling came before he won the 2024 election, obviously, but it certainly sort of codified the idea that if he won, he would be able to break the law with impunity. And I think we have already seen that he's used this in the foreign policy realm. His actions surrounding the deportation of the unlawful detention and deportation of nonviolent migrants, and then not being unwilling to try to bring back those who his own administration admits were falsely detained, and the sort of vague and very unclear deal that he seems to have with, for example, the president of El Salvador. This is all just so murky and seemingly arbitrary, and yet there's no mechanism really, other than Congress, which is completely unwilling to do a whole lot on its own, to do much scrutinizing of it, much less actually constraining.
So the Constitution, of course, gives the executive branch the right to formulate and execute foreign policy. The two main jobs of Congress, of the legislative branch, are first the power of the purse, and the second, oversight.
I would just take a little issue with that, because I think, and I don't disagree that is sort of what we have in practice. But one thing that congressional scholars like to point out is that Congress also has the power to declare war, which it no longer exercises ever. And I do think that is an important piece to remember. And it's tied up with the congressional sort of abdication of power of the purse and so forth. But I think, it is important to remember there was a time when you really did have to get Congress to even begrudgingly approve. And even in the era of undeclared wars, you would often get an authorization, sometimes after the fact, but authorization to use military force. I don't think that the Constitution grants the president authority to simply make foreign policy. I think it was conceived as a sort of partnership, and especially with trade policy, there always used to be a much greater role for Congress.
Yes, in practice, the formulation exercise of foreign policy depends entirely on how far the president is willing to push, right? How many lines he and his administration are willing to cross. The Secretary of State has said that no court can tell me what is in the foreign policy interest of the United States. Is there any basis for that?
The Trump administration would argue there is. I think this is where it's really important to distinguish between deference to executive authority, which has, as you say, I mean, the reality has been that the president has been the first mover and has not been particularly constrained. You know, I would date that from the post World War II era, but there's still been a political process through which the president has, on some occasions, wanted the buy-in of Congress and has been willing to pay the price, the political price of obtaining that buy-in, sometimes through significant political bargaining and coercion. And this is the subject of my most recently published book, The Insider's Game, if you don't mind me mentioning it. I would say as recently as the Iraq War, George Bush showed that he really did care that, every last vote that he could get for the Iraq War, the authorization to use military force, he wanted. And he put a tremendous amount of pressure on his own party and on certain Democrats. You've always had, since World War II, the president is really not even first among equals, but just the first mover and has all the built-in advantages. Congress acquiesced to some extent, but that was partly because after the dawn of the nuclear age, the executive branch and the national security state became too complicated and for Congress to be stepping in all the time. And so there was a lot of delegation to the executive, and some of that made sense, right? And in the Cold War, you still had a bipartisan, not consensus, but you had enough of a kind of critical mass in the middle of the political spectrum that people did cross party lines. You had a constituency of Southern Democratic hawks. You had a constituency of sort of Northern Republican moderates who were not, whose votes could go for arms control sometimes, right? And so you could craft political bargains. You could pay a certain amount of political cost and obtain a big benefit, which was the endorsement of the whole of another branch of government for your risky foreign policy, whether that was a peace treaty or arms control treaty or a war. Now it's almost impossible to do that. I really only study the security side of things, but to me, the tariff episodes have been even more frightening because that's the area where at least Congress used to be quite involved. And that's pretty new that they have essentially just gone along with the president in that arena with hardly any protest. It's not just that we have a president who has decided to disregard all the boundaries. Is that the political cost of respecting boundaries has just gone away. You're relying on the goodwill of one person, and that's not the system that the founding fathers had in mind.
Do you see signs that for other countries, Trump may look like an emperor?
I think that any country would be foolish not to see him as an emperor. I don't know how other countries are thinking about negotiating trade deals in an environment like this. I mean, there have been some that have been rolled out, but we don't really know all the details. It's also pretty clear that it's not clear that the Trump administration is a reliable partner. So, before the Japan deal was announced, there was reporting in the press that Japan was quite frustrated because they had been engaging in these trade talks in good faith, and the Trump administration and Trump himself would introduce these new demands at the last minute, right? And obviously trade negotiations are always complex. I mean, they typically, as you know, undoubtedly know, and your audience surely knows, take place over years and, exhaustive and every comma and all that, right? So last minute happenings are not so much the problem, but it's all happening so fast and the last minute things are upending the whole deal. That I think is new. Again, I'm no trade negotiation expert, but I think that's a good example of where just reading the newspaper, you would find, if you were reading the New York Times and the Washington Post in a foreign capital, I think you'd be pretty concerned. And then you get to questions like what he did with respect to Brazil, sending Lula this letter saying, we're going to impose these incredibly high tariffs unless you, stop prosecuting Bolsonaro. I mean, that is interfering in the domestic politics of another country's legal process. Again, I'm no, I don't, the United States has done plenty of that in its history. So I don't mean to whitewash the history of American meddling in foreign countries, suitcases full of cash in the Cold War to influence elections, that kind of thing. It's usually done in a more subtle manner, which doesn't make it any more right, but it is mind-boggling to see it play out in a social media post and to have it so nakedly, stripped of all pretense. We will tariff you if you don't leave Bolsonaro alone. It's just different in kind, not just in degree. So,
and let's face it, it has been quite a while since the United States interfered in that way. Abroad.
Well, sure, but we've also, we invaded Iraq in 2003. Yes, more than 20 years. I mean, I'm plenty cynical, right? I assume that there are other ones we don't know about, and we hope that when the documents are declassified, we will find out. But we don't, there was even a diplomatic process leading up to that. And I think looking back on it, again, without passing judgment on the war in either direction, what strikes me is looking back how much Bush and the Bush administration took care, right? They did want congressional backing. They put tremendous political muscle behind obtaining it. He listened to Colin Powell and went to the UN. He didn't really want to do that, but he did it. And he didn't want to go a second time, but he wanted Tony Blair to be, satisfied with his own domestic politics. This is unfathomable in the current administration. And as, I think I didn't really get to your original question about the Secretary of State being the one who could just declare that this is against foreign policy interests. I mean, what you have here, there's so many layers to that, right? Colin Powell was able to convince Bush to change course and do this UN track, right? Didn't have a huge amount of influence over the final outcome, but compare that to Marco Rubio, who apparently has abandoned most of his previously held beliefs and is now, doing Trump's bidding sort of uncritically, right? In other words, not giving him candid advice that Trump is then perfectly free to take or leave. He's just anticipating what Trump wants and giving it to him and saying yes and chiming in these Oval Office meetings to back up the president no matter what the president says, right? But the other thing is, it is pretty clear that Congress never intended this law to be used in this manner. When this provision was used in the 50s in the sort of Red Scare, un-American speech, conduct, that kind of thing. And we know this because in the 1990s, and I can't swear what date, but I'm pretty sure it was in the early 1990s, they actually limited the use of this law to very specific instances where only in the rarest of cases would the foreign policy exception, this person, this person should have their visa canceled or be deported because of their, effect on foreign policy. And then it was struck down in the courts by Donald Trump's own sister, Marion Trump Barry, who was a judge in the federal courts. And that decision was overturned on a technicality, which is why this law is still on the books. But they have seized on it as a means for detaining and attempting to deport foreign students on the basis of free speech, or on the basis of speech, which should be protected, the courts have said, by the First Amendment. So, in other words, not only do we know that it was never supposed to be the case that one person could make decisions about fundamental rights on U.S. soil, but the Congress very specifically did not intend for this law to be used in this way. And so you have a few individuals making enormous decisions with constitutional rights at stake. And it's hard to know what to tell students in classrooms, and it's hard to know where the lines are anymore. And again, politics and the shadow of politics, those lines are fuzzy. And so today it's somebody wrote an op-ed in a student newspaper, and the courts have ordered her release, but she's still subject. I mean, these are all the students have been let out of the detention facilities, but they're still subject to, they're still in litigation, right? They're still in the courts, they're still being, they await more court dates. And that's a pretty terrifying prospect. And it also is unclear what it means for the free speech rights of everybody else on any issue that the government might decide is a threat to the foreign policy of the United States. It's a bit unfathomable if you grew up in the system assuming that, free speech was free speech, whether you like it or not.
All right, let's talk about politics and diplomacy. So I always say that it's a dysfunctional marriage. It seems to me that politics influences diplomacy much more than diplomacy influences politics. And I would like to see a balance.
One of the pieces that I wrote for Foreign Affairs previously was actually arguing that we need more politics in foreign affairs and not less, because we no longer debate foreign policy in Congress at all. And that is really the arena where you would get this kind of debate, right? And I think the fact that we no longer have people willing to cross party lines, willing to sort of stake their political reputations on their knowledge of foreign policy, that used to be an important thing for presidential aspirants, right? They wanted to be seen as having credibility on foreign policy issues. And that's just no longer the case, right? And so I think that having political ambition is a natural thing in a democracy. Tying that ambition to policy expertise is a good idea. And so you want those incentives driving in the same direction, where it's good to be the person in Congress who knows about Yemen, like Chris Murphy, right? That's one of the remaining cases where you can identify somebody with real expertise on a topic or an issue. In the Cold War, you had Sam Nunn. If you wanted to do anything nuclear, you had to go through Sam Nunn. That's important. And I think that politics, the fusion of politics and diplomacy really helps to make sure that when diplomats are able to go negotiate, say, arms control agreements, when it comes time for ratification, the people doing the ratifying have some knowledge and stake and can properly debate it and can vote on it in good faith. And so the retreat of politics from diplomacy, I think, leaves it at the mercy of individuals in a way that is dangerous. I would say that what's missing now is not so much a grand vision, but the ability to course correct. That's what we've really lost. Our politics can no longer hold people accountable for mistakes, can't learn from those mistakes, can't generate an alternative path, right? And so we're stuck in this position where we don't like the old way, but we don't have a way to democratically agree on what the new way should be.
What worries you the most in terms of where we will be in 3.5 years, both as a scholar and as a citizen?
I think the information environment is really the fact that we no longer seem to agree on basic facts is probably the most concerning to me. You have to be able to look at a photograph and agree on what it depicts. You have to have confidence that the photograph is real. And there's an AI dimension to that, but leaving that aside, I think we were in that place of not agreeing on basic facts before ChatGPT and AI really began to change the game. And I think the way it's one of those things that AI is exacerbating that problem because we already disagreed about basic facts. So I think the absence of media that are sort of common to everybody, people used to say the big three broadcast networks, the voice of God, right? The Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather, and, before him, Walter Cronkite and so forth. It was not great that there was such concentration or it had downsides, let's put it that way. But it also meant that that most Americans got a version of the same set of facts. And I think that it's pretty dangerous from a foreign policy perspective that that's no longer the case, whether it has to do with, the facts of what happened with the bombing of Iran, or down to, is there any way that you can ever satisfy somebody that a certain event did or did not take place? I mean, that to me is the most worrisome thing that apart from individual issues, that's the larger, most concerning trend that I don't know how we come back from that.
Is there any chance that all the chaos and unpredictability that we're living through will lead to something positive in international relations?
I'm sure people smarter than I am could come up with something. But I think international politics thrives on predictability, and it's hard to see from sitting here in the first, 6 months of the Trump administration, it's hard to see.
Without judging whether it's a positive or negative, I personally think that the main consequence of what's happening will be that the world will learn how to survive, operate, and thrive without the United States in the lead.
That may be one of the consequences. It's a little bit like the famous Churchill, democracy's the worst system except for all the others, right? From an American perspective, the rap on the liberal international order used to be that it was too beneficial to the United States. Not that it was a ripoff, that it was built by the United States for the United States. Whether a world in which everybody else is capable of operating without the United States, I think you're right that may be the consequence. Whether that's good for U.S. foreign policy and national security and prosperity in the international system or not, that very much is, stay tuned.
All for the world.
Yeah. Yes, or for the world. Exactly.
Right. Well, thank you. Good to talk to you.
Yes, likewise.
Thank you for joining us. And remember, diplomacy is the world's best hope. See you next time.